morning, Niigaan.
Hey, hey.
This for your translation. I don't know how to say good morning in French. Bonjour.
Hello, Tansi. Bonjour. Bonjour. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. My name is Sandra Bender, and I am the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the NCTR. Before I turn it over to our honored speakers today, I'm just going to share some quick housekeeping notes. First, there will be simultaneous translation into ASL and French available throughout the conversation. The ASL will be right here on the English channel. To have French, you will need to switch to the French channel, which is under the globe button called Interpretation. Il y aura une traduction simultanée en français sous le bouton appelé Interprétation. Vous pouvez trouver ce bouton sous le globe ou peut-être dedans les trois points appelés More. Pour le français, s'il vous plaît, changez la chaîne maintenant. We are so pleased to be partnering with Shapeshifter for our tech support this year. They are, as they have been all week, recording this session, and you should be able to find the video on our YouTube channel after the fact. This is a webinar setup, which means that cameras, microphones, and the chat function are not enabled. You may, however, use the Q&A function to submit questions, and our speakers will leave about 10 minutes to address some of them toward the end. There are a huge number of people with us today, which is really fantastic. But what that means is there will only be time for very few of these questions to be answered. If you're particularly burning for an answer, you can submit your question to the email address that sent you the Zoom link today. Please, we expect that all questions will be asked with respect. The NCTR is located in Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe, Inninawak, Anishinawak, Dene, Dakota, and the Red River Métis nations. We are located in a province that sources power from dams on the mighty river systems of the North in Treaty 5, and drink water that comes from Treaty 3. For all of us joining from across Turtle Island, I invite you to take a moment to consider the First Peoples whose lands these have always been and always will be, with or without treaty agreements. As we enter today's discussion, I invite you to open your minds, hearts, and spirits that we may speak truth, hear truth, and move forward together in better paths. It is now my distinct honor to introduce today's speakers and moderator. We have with us Eugene Arcand, who is a survivor, athlete, member of the original TRC Survivor Circle, and current member of the NCTR Survivor Circle. Dr. Niigaanwewidam Sinclair, who is a journalist and professor of Indigenous Studies, author, and also the son of the late Honorable Murray Sinclair, or Mazinagishikiban. And our moderator, Dr. Sean Carleton, who is also an author and professor of Indigenous Studies and one of the leading experts globally on residential school denialism. We are so grateful to have the three of you here to lead this important conversation. Sean, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Sandra, for the introduction and getting us started. And of course, thanks to the thousands of you joining us for this year's final NCTR Truth and Reconciliation Lunch and Learn event today on confronting residential school denialism. It's very heartening to see you all here. I'm very honored to be in conversation with Eugene and Niigaan on this very important subject, because residential school denialism, or the willful downplaying, minimizing, or twisting residential school knowledge to undermine and shake public confidence in truth and reconciliation, is very much on the rise here in Canada. 10 years after the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, which we are marking this year, right? A lot of good work has been done, but clearly not enough, with the vast majority of the 94 calls to action still to be completed. Moreover, There are a handful of people, some with considerable influence on social media and in politics, who are choosing to spend their time engaging in, supporting, and even creating and profiting from the promotion of residential school denialism, pushing the same old talking points that we've heard over and over again. Things like it was well intentioned, it was of the times, abuse is exaggerated, there were no deaths in the schools or they were inevitable, unmarked graves are a hoax and fake news, etc., etc. This is all part of a playbook, a strategy to distract us from the important work of putting truth before reconciliation. In fact, the TRC actually has a very simple formula. First, we must have truth. Truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will give us a shot at meaningful reconciliation. And denialists know this formula and see reconciliation as a threat rather than as an opportunity. And so what they're trying to do is twist the truth, to shake confidence in it, to get people lost in the minutia, the details, right, as a tactic or strategy to close off the pathway to healing justice and reconciliation. And that is obviously quite concerning. So to get us started, my job is really the moderator and give the floor to Eugene and Niigaan to help walk us through both how we can understand this, why people do this, and what we might be able to do about it so that we can continue that journey towards reconciliation. And I guess I wanted to start off by asking first Eugene and then Niigaan, how you understand denialism, perhaps personally, and why you think it is so harmful.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning to everyone. And good morning to all those on Treaty 1 territory. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, Muskeg Cree Nation, land off reserve in the city of Saskatoon. Niigaan, no te nas kuma gama te betsige to ma no skaki amote pe to taihua, ka pento tamagatsio, evanina ka pe atsumoa. I started off by thanking the Creator for bringing us all together today, for Niigaan and I to share our opinions and for all of you to hear them. In the Cree language, it's called Iatamskatagok, which means I hope you get out of this what we are equal to the amount that we are sharing with you. Now back to Sean's question. I guess I'd start off by showing you my class picture from 1958. In this picture, there are 32 kids. Those are my classmates in 1958. It's taken approximately the third week in September. And I don't recall the picture. I remember the outing. It's a black and white picture because pictures were not supposed to be taken. And then on that day, under the guise of picking leaves and grass in a field, the teacher from Canoe Lake First Nation, who was also a residential school survivor by the name of Peggy Iron, got us together and took this picture. There are 32 kids in this picture. 7 of us are still alive. Not one of them committed suicide. Not one. They had every right to and had every reason to, with the everyday threat of physical, sexual, psychological, and emotional abuse. Now, deny that. In my opening comments here, I want everyone that's watching and listening to understand that I don't want your pity. We don't want your pity. We don't want you feeling sorry for us. If that's what you think denialism is about, you're walking down the wrong track, as usual. What we want and what we do and why we do what we do and why I do what I do is to provide the truth. The truth about Canada's darkest secret. I was a part of and a witness to a destruction of a people. Nothing can tell me or show me or prove to me different when I know that My mother went to residential school. My grandparents were in residential school. And that this social engineering experiment that went badly wrong needs some correcting, and it requires the truth. I'll leave it at that for now. I do have more, but I'd like to turn it over to Niigaan to share his opening comments. Hi.
Okay, Miigwech, Eugene, and appreciate everybody spending time today and engaging. I'm in a very big boardroom, so I hope you can hear me. I just finished a keynote, and I've been in 6 different cities in 6 days. My point is that don't ever let anyone tell you that the Orange Shirt Day, National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, isn't a nationwide movement with the biggest amount of buy-in and commitment that we've ever seen in history. I'm living proof of it, just having gone to different places and seen. I'm in a building right now in a place in which there are hundreds of people all wearing orange shirts. And in fact, I don't think there's anyone who's not in this building. My point of it is that don't get caught up in distraction. And I wrote a column about this just recently. And what I said is there's lots of reasons to think the world's burning, and legitimate reasons. There's absolutely lots of reasons to post on your social media, reconciliation is dead, because you hear this person over here doing this thing, unwelcome, not invited, saying terrible things. And, I think there is probably nobody that is at their core of their argument more fraught with terrible things than residential school denialists. As Sean and I have written many times, Eugene has spoken, there are many credentialed, respected, employed people who are in institutions, who are recognized by colleagues and peers, and who have said residential school denialism is based in really 3 central purposes. The first is to say Indigenous peoples are lying. The second is to say Indigenous peoples are exaggerating. And the third is that Indigenous peoples want power, fame, money. Of course, money is the #1 core reason for the first 2. And none of that is true. In fact, if any of that was true, it would certainly be indicative of a much different looking country. Because what you have is residential school survivors who were offered millions of dollars that they could have walked away from this issue, and they would have legitimately accepted that money for the harm that they had experienced. And instead they said, no, we are taking the vast majority, nearly 90% of the compensation that they were offered, and put that in the TRC. They funded the TRC. The TRC was not funded by a government until the very final steps of the TRC, and that was mostly logistical. The TRC was funded by survivors. If survivors are so interested in money, fame, and power, then they would have walked away from this country. They would have said, we're not interested in building anything that would be interested, engaging the education system, which had harmed us so deeply. In fact, we're going to build the education system, and we're going to do it on our own dime. So the key is to understand that anytime you hear a residential school denialist whose center argument is that Indigenous peoples are lying, exaggerating, and only seeking money, just look at the evidence. And I think that this is where we really, and I could pick apart different arguments that have been thrown at me, put into different circles in whatever way, and whatever newsletter is created this week, and whatever random website with completely made up facts and research. There's not even really research, it's just conjecture. We have 4 main problems that residential school denialists are creating for all the rest of us in the country. And that's really what we have to focus on, not on the individual, because as I've said, and as I wrote in my column, if you focus on the individual, these talking points are very simply puppeted, repeated by another individual who just fills in the space, because in some corners of the country, it's fairly lucrative to argue that gravity doesn't exist. You're free to make that argument if gravity doesn't exist. If you want to argue that when I throw this rock in the air, that it's not gravity that makes it fall, but magic fairies, that's fine. You have a right to do that. I just don't want you flying a plane. And that where you should not be employed, influencing, impacting people who are seeking credentialed education, because if you want to argue that nonsense is sense, then frankly, you are just doing 4 main problems. And here's the 4 main problems. The first is that you're ignoring vetted, credentialed work by scholars who have vast experience working with survivors, communities, and research that has been passed by multiple layers of academic layers of work, committees, entire bodies created by not just private but also public entities. Like just go look at anyone's works cited area, and if they have vetted, committed, completed, credentialed research, and they work with that research instead of just saying, oh, I'm going to quote this research, but none of it matters. None of it has anything worthwhile to say. I would not pass a first-year class in my class. If you are going to cite something and you have to engage those issues fairly, equitably, in a just way, than just simply saying, oh, this person is full of nothing or has absolutely nothing worthwhile to say. That's the first problem that residential school denialists encourage, which is all of us to ignore the decades upon decades of credentialed research. And of course, the best and most worthwhile, the most robust study of residential schools is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who had dozens, in fact, hundreds of academics, researchers who all have vast experience working both with real people and in archival, and also working in institutions and in areas in which documents were often hidden or kept from the TRC. And they worked very hard to make sure that that was a part of the arguments. We're still trying to collect the documents. And that leads to the second challenge, which is that when we simply ignore facts, then we get into all we're interested in is conflict. Because those of us who have to actually live in this world, those of us who actually have to work with real life people and have to create real life credentialed research at institutions that demand vetted, decent, real life work that have real life impact on people, then we're at conflict with people who want to argue that magic fairies exist. And the whole problem, of course, is that is just conflict. And so any time that I engage it, just simply gets into an argument of does gravity exist, which frankly I can defeat not only in 2 seconds, but if somebody doesn't want to see gravity exist, then they're only interested in arguing with people who say that gravity does exist, which creates this third problem, which is that when those of us that engage people who don't want to argue on any merits, on any decent credentialed work, are only invested in conflict, everything becomes inefficient. Everything becomes very stop, and everything becomes very slowed down. And the process of reconciliation, you only have to travel around the country, go to schools, go to universities, go to public centers, go to private centers, go to almost any single government, even those who are different political stripes and perspectives. And reconciliation, the momentum is moving so fast, faster in some places than others, but it is moving even across the country at ways in which we had never expected things to be at this point. I've seen things in my lifetime that I think I never would have saw. My father saw things in his lifetime that he never would have imagined. And our children, they are the most competent generation in history. They've learned about this issue. They've learned about residential schools. They've learned about Indigenous contributions and that Indigenous peoples have created everything we know of as Canada, from healthcare to multiculturalism to democracy to free speech, to every penny on every paycheck, to every single way that we even see the country. The word Kanata is an Indigenous word. What else do you need to know? Indigenous peoples are absolutely the heart of everything that is Canadian. And when we say Indigenous peoples don't matter, or lying, or exaggerating, or are not bought into the country, then we're just creating an inefficient process. Now, this is where the fourth and perhaps the biggest problem is that we have much bigger things to talk about, much bigger things to do than to work at an inefficient process, arguing that gravity doesn't exist with people who just are interested in conflict. So yes, of course, I value people who do this work, who engage people who want to make unrealistic, unreasonable, totally cherry-picked facts, individuals here and there, to throw something in about a series of whataboutisms. But it really distracts from the real work that we need to do. We have an economic and environmental crisis in front of us. Indigenous peoples have to be center of both of those solutions. We have to stop blaming Indigenous peoples when they ask Canada to follow their own laws, their own constitution, and recognize that recognize and affirm that Indigenous and treaty rights are at the center core of this country. Now, I did that very fast, but what my point is that this panel, while I value it great deeply, we should be really talking about other things like the fact that we need to keep funding incredible bodies like the NCTR, put pressure on the federal government to make sure that we get an amazing center so that we can continue to tell those stories and that our generations and generations of young people have a safe place to go and to learn about who they are fundamentally, both Canadians and Indigenous peoples, to learn what is the core of this country, which can be uncomfortable. But when we get there, as my father said, when we climb that mountain and we reach that summit, we see things that we've never seen before, and man, are they beautiful. So my vision, my hope is that we have conversations that get us to beauty, not get mired into the struggle of climbing the mountain with people who want to believe there isn't even a mountain to climb.
Well, thanks so much, Eugene and Niigaan, for those very powerful opening words to get us kind of grounded and our heads around what we're dealing with. And I think, Niigaan, your last point there is, we're having this conversation about, instead of why is Canada stalling out on its commitment to the calls to action? Why have we not completed more calls to action? And denialists will happily keep us stuck debating the truth so that we're not having these bigger conversations. I think one way to move us forward is to explain to people who perhaps don't experience this denialism why it is so harmful and hurtful. And Christy McLeod and Phyllis Webstead, the founder of the Orange Shirt movement, have recently published a book that explains why the denialism in particular that Phyllis has experienced and why it is such a barrier to moving forward. And I'm wondering if both of you could speak a little bit to, why you see this as so damaging, so that we can then move on to talk about what we do about it.
I'll step up for the start. Thank you, Niigaan and Sean, for those very sincere, intelligent, academic statements that the young people who are watching probably understand a heck of a lot better than I do. Although I am not naive to everything you've talked about, I guess I come from a different perspective as a residential school survivor who experienced a lived experience of 11 years. My number was 781. I no longer had a name. For 9 years, I endured 781. All of my gitch, my clothes, my sports equipment had a number. And I never thought this would ever happen in my lifetime. I really, really, sincerely, honestly never thought it would become a major subject area in this country. We had lived a life of not understanding shame. The shame of having endured activities with adults and members of the clergy that were totally against the law then and are totally against the law now. And I get very upset at these denialists who I've never met yet, because I don't think their cowardice would have been able to endure what we did. You take any one of your children, that little 5-year-old girl, that little 5-year-old boy, and you take them out of your home, and they never see their grandparents again, which was my experience for 9 years. How would you deny that this happened? And keep in mind, in the province that I'm in, one of the provinces that does not recognize Orange Shirt Day, along with our neighboring province of Alberta, it's shameful. There were 17 schools in operation, if you can call them schools. I call them jails. I did 11 years hard time. It took at least 75 people to operate each of these institutions over the course of time. 75 per year. Supervisors, engineers, clergy, nuns, teachers. And for all those years, this happened in my province, in your province, and right across the land. going into the north. In all of my travels in the 10 years since the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was presented, in all of my travels, north, east, south, west, I have come across a maximum of 5 people who have come up to me and said, Eugene, I am so ashamed to admit that my grandpa, my grandma, or one of my ancestors worked in these institutions. And I'm so sorry. I always let them know, you don't have to be sorry. But if you are, I forgive you. I understand you did nothing wrong. It was your ancestors that may have done this. And I bring this up because it makes me wonder what motivates these cowards that write books and go to GoFundMe to make the living they do off the backs of our misery. What motivates them? Do they have something to hide? Do they have ancestors who are deviants and perverts, taking advantage of children, and they don't want anyone to know that? Do you have ancestors that were child beaters? Is that why you do what you're doing? You're trying to cover up your history? Why is it that wherever I travel, residential school survivors come out in droves? But none of these supervisors, none of these people come and say what those courageous 5 people did. Like, if that's what motivates you, then you need help. You know, in my learning, and I'm not an academic, I have no post-secondary education. I'm from the School of Hard Knocks. But in all of this time, I looked up to doctors, whether they be legitimate academic acquired doctors, physical doctors, psychological doctors. I lifted them up. I admired them. And then now I see this. What kind of doctors are these? When I look at their bios, every one of them were raised in an environment of privilege. None of them have lived with poverty. Very few of them have experienced addictions. What motivates these people? What sickens these people to the point where they lose their conscience and their heart to be real human beings? We're doing the best we can here as residential school survivors. Out of the 153,000 that received common experience payment, there are less than 40% of us left. You have a chance in your lifetime as a denier that if you're not happy with the story that we've shared, with what we have exposed, you have a place to go back to, and you're quite welcome to go. Leave our treaty areas in Turtle Island and go back and cause trouble in your own country. But don't come to our country and tell us that we're liars on our own lands. But I know none of you could have taken the abuse that we absorbed. So I'll turn it again over to Niigaan. Before I go there, Niigaan, I want to say one thing here. Reconciliation to me is simply a buzzword. If it's not preceded by truth, it means nothing to me. It's all talk, no action. Because when you take up this agenda, as it relates to Indian residential schools and the true history of this country and John A. Macdonald's social engineering secret that went wrong, why would I want to reconcile with that? I've seen the worst of the newcomers and the settlers come to this country and destroy my people, the original people of this land, under the guise of taking the Indian out of the child to educate us. Well, I know that system. I may not be an academic, but I know that system, and I know it wasn't built for me, and it wasn't built for my people. So When you're talking about reconciliation, know what you're reconciling. Don't talk for nothing. When you're reconciling, you want to make change. You know, I don't like that word as a standalone word, because what am I reconciling? Other than the dysfunctional person that came out of there when I was 17 years old in April 1969, and all the havoc I wreaked in society because I was damaged goods for many years that didn't understand what I had endured. I was so full of hate of the settler community. For 30 years, I carried this shame until a miraculous thing happened and a person started talking about blameless shame at the point where I understood I did nothing wrong. That the shame that I was carrying and trying to drown with alcohol and drugs was what was imposed on me by a pervert or a deviant or some crazed individual that liked having their way with children, caused me to be damaged goods. Am I blaming them? You're damn right I'm blaming them. They're the sickos that were transferred from institution to institution. And if that's what you denialists are hiding and those were your ancestors, I forgive you. But don't come around my space talking nonsense about this didn't happen, because I know none of you cowards would ever want to trade places with any of us. Thank you.
Miigwech, thanks so much, Eugene. Yeah, absolutely. Reconciliation without truth is just a bunch of empty ornamental gestures that don't carry any weight at all because they're uninformed and they're you know, it's hard to blame. It's hard to boil this down to inefficiency and conflict, but that's how simple it is. Is that when you promote an agenda or an idea that just simply ignores every single other thing that had been done, you're just an island of singular ideas that have not based in truth at all. They're not. They're simply just a bunch of whataboutisms that are cherry picked here and there, and they are slanted in particular ways where you get distracted. And I guess the biggest one, I think, to get back to your question, Sean, your question was, how does it impact us, or what have we personally felt about it? And then what are the impacts of this denialism on the broader Canadian community? And I think that the best example, although there are many examples, is when the community came out and talked a lot about the findings at Kamloops as just an example, and never mind all the other things. Right in my community in Brandon, there is a dozen children that are buried underneath an RV park that was sold to by the city of Brandon to a private developer. And the private developer, or perhaps the city, or we're not quite sure who, simply removed the markers of those burial spaces that were legitimately there, recognized by other private organizations before that, and never mind the fact that there was a long history of knowledge of the school that was there. It was really the fact that everybody harped on a simple admitted mistake that many of us in the media and many of us across the country made when we started to use the term mass grave. And it was really picked up because the whole notion of multiple anomalies that suggest graves in a site is a mass grave, is suggesting a mass grave. And let's get to the term mass grave for a second. There are tens of thousands of children that went to the schools that disappeared. We know that many of them died. We don't quite know how many. We also don't know how many were lost according to records, or that how many tried to escape, or that how many maybe perhaps were married off in different communities and sent to other places and didn't want to. They were taught not to go home. All of that is a signifier of death, whether it be physical or cultural death. So you can absolutely use the term mass grave, but let's just get into everybody what harped upon is to say, well, it's not this mass grave that we've seen in a picture describing World War II or Rwanda or whatever. And so when everybody got into the, when I say everybody, meaning a particular newspaper and that particular people who really want to harp on one particular singular moment and not actually deal with the issue of lost children, not actually deal with the reality people, communities that are searching for those children, and then ultimately that we may find answers not in the exhuming of bodies, which just means you don't even understand science, and that when there were inappropriate burials, that we're going to take a long time, probably decades, to test soil samples to be able to just begin to scratch the surface of perhaps are there children lost, and maybe that might be one of their burial sites. Never mind all of that. It's just that when you get caught up in the term mass grave and you say, well, it's not a mass grave because it doesn't define this over here. It reminds me a lot of certain historians who say it is not genocide simply because I've decided that there was no mental intent of harm at residential schools. Well, I can tell you that ask any survivor, and there was absolutely mental harm. And not only was there mental harm, but there was intentional mental harm every single day of your experience. Listen to the stories that Eugene's taken. And if you want to take the position that survivors, as I said before, are liars, exaggerate, and are only seeking money, then really there's nothing more to talk about, because then what you're taking the position of is you're taking the position that I'm just going to ignore basic facts, like the fact that I spoke about, which was if survivors were so motivated by money or lying or exaggerating, they would have just walked away during the creation of the TRC. But no, they paid for it. So just look at the facts. And not only is the facts valid for you, don't get caught up in trying to stretch definitions to meet your facts. That's called confirmation bias. And that's the kind of stuff that would not pass any sniff test of any particular argument, unless you want to write a website for you and your friends. If you want to make a newsletter for a handful of people that all want to believe the same thing, then you have a right to do that. I'm not here to say that you can't create that website. It's just that we also have should be a consequence to spreading misinformation. And there also, one of those consequences should be that people who are legitimate, who are credentialed, and who have much more important work to do than to argue basic, the parameters of basic facts, which are numerously proven time and time again, that we have the right to not engage it and find other things to do. And most importantly, more important things to do. And part of that is that, I think that's what we're talking about as we're leaning towards. But I think the mass grave, and particularly one newspaper who made a lot of print ink, earned a lot of money, and also sowed a lot of division over what was ultimately a cherry-picked issue. You wrote about this, Sean, in when you focus only on one term and you don't actually deal with what the issue is, which is lost children, searching for those children, you can get caught up and talk about anything. Purple people eaters, if you say, let's focus on the purple people eaters all day, and the fact that they never really existed in the first place, then that's right ahead.
Yeah,
but otherwise, work to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is exactly what I was saying off the top, is that this is part of the strategy of undermining people's confidence in the truth, using disingenuous arguments, sophistry, deflection, distraction, so that, and these are often alluring talking points to people who do feel like understanding the truth about residential schooling is difficult, and it is hard, right? I grew up down the street. I'm a non-Indigenous person. I grew up down the street from a residential school and didn't know it until my mid-20s. And learning about the effect of that institution on my neighbors, it's difficult work. And so, people would like to find a way out, right? And denialists are offering alluring narratives, right, that can hive off support for truth and reconciliation. But it's very damaging. This is the thing that we need to know and acknowledge so that we can move on, is the harm that it causes deliberately to survivors, right? The intimidation and harassment of experts and allies, all of that is deliberate, right? It is trying to railroad us, and put an anchor on truth and reconciliation work. And we have to acknowledge the harm that it creates, the death threats that Niigaan and I get, that Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor, received in her work, people showing up in the middle of the night at the Kamloops residential school demanding to dig for proof, when we already know that 51 children died in that school, by church and state records alone. This is what people will say, no bodies have been found. That's incorrect. Exhumation has happened, as difficult as it is. Historical records have confirmed additional deaths since 2021 at Williams Lake, right, at Cooper Island, at other institutions. The coroner's office in Ontario it launched an investigation and have confirmed additional deaths that happened. But denialists want to undermine all of that work as an intimidation tactic so that we get distracted. And I mentioned Phyllis Webstead and Christine McLeod's book, and they basically say we need to acknowledge that denialism is a problem first, so that we can move on to talk about how can we deal with it, and move on to the important parts of justice and healing and reconciliation. So let's move our conversation in that direction with our remaining time. Murray Sinclair used to say that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what is going to get us out. What do you both think needs to be done to help people, non-Indigenous people in particular, understand how to challenge residential school denialism? Where do we go from here once we acknowledge that it is a problem and it is causing harm and hurt? And we can now focus on what we do about it so that we can move forward. What are your thoughts on those next steps?
I don't have any one answer, and I don't think there is any one answer. But I just want to clarify a couple of things that, just to make them a little more clear on what Niigaan shared with you on we as residential school survivors having worked together to get the exposing of Canada's darkest secret happen through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm forever grateful to the late Murray Sinclair and his colleagues, Marie Wilson and Willie Vilchild, for having put themselves out there. But while we're going through this exercise of the truth being revealed, it's got to be also made clear that there are many, many secular professionals and paraprofessionals that made a damn good living and became millionaires off the backs of that residential school settlement agreement. Nothing is said about these secular lawyers who took advantage of residential school survivors in this process. Nothing is said of these fly-by-night companies who set up ground-penetrating radar companies to come into our communities and say, we'll find it for you, then withholding the results until they were paid more money. You want to accuse residential school survivors of doing this for money, then why are we all still in poverty? The minimal thousands of $10,000 that we got for this and that, hell, it all went back into the secular community to try and pay off our bills, try and put some groceries on the table. But we have people who worked on the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement who became part of the agreement and are the people who are denialists and erasers of history. In the meantime, walking to their ATM machine and withdrawing all kinds of money, again, off the backs of our misery, and we're still living on the front lines of homelessness, addictions. This is all the fallout of Indian residential schools. You take First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people out of any social sector in every large center, including Winnipeg. You take us out of the education sector, within 1 month, City of Winnipeg education system would go bankrupt. You take us out of any provincial, federal, justice, incarceration, probationary, young offender, criminalization by RCMP, city police, and other police forces in this country, and you take us out of that sector, again, they would go bankrupt. I'm not even talking about health. I'm not even talking about the other social sectors. That's the reality of what the root of the residential schools caused in this country. It made one segment of society, an industry that in Western Canada, if we were taken out of that sector, you'd be the ones homeless. The settler community and the newcomers would be the ones homeless. That is the reality of the world I look at. I just spoke to a class this morning of 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, all of them, every one of them is a descendant of a residential school survivor in some capacity. They have already experienced racism. They have already experienced poverty. They have already experienced levels of family violence, gangsterism, and all the social ills of life. Can I say that 50% of the people who are watching and listening to this, can I say that they have experienced the same thing? Are we the minority there also? I ask these tough, hard questions because they haunt me. They don't only haunt me, they haunt my fellow survivors. And when lunatics like who showed up at the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation yesterday are requesting a level of respect because they're a doctor and yet terrorizing our sacred places, you don't see the same behavior coming from us to the Catholic churches who destroyed me or destroyed us. I'll just leave it at that for now.
So just to be clear, Sean, you're talking about education and what are some ways that education will get us out of this? Is that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people will say, okay, now that I understand that denialism is a thing, what can we do about it? What are the next steps?
So here's this is where we get into kind of an ironic moment as a country. I think all of us we're leaders in our different corners of the world. We're leaders when we think about all the different calls to action 1 through 42, which are the systems that Eugene started to talk about there, and of course education being one of the most important, but also health, justice, child welfare. That's the first 42 calls. We have emergency situations in all of those industries, and we have to do something about it yesterday. The injustice is rampant and pure in all of those institutions. And then we get to education. We say, and your question is well, how can education get us out of this sort of mess when it comes to denialism? In that we give a lot of energy and a lot of attention to what is ultimately a very small group of people, but that small group of people are influencing others and are creating harm. And so don't ever think that I'm saying we should deny them or ignore them or completely. The fact is that I don't want to get caught up. I've got too much work to do. And so I do definitely appreciate those who are spending time talking about denialism and engaging them. And what I'm always interested in is not engaging individuals, but engaging the movement or the fact that that movement is impacting others. And I want you to look at the age of who has been impacted the most. And this is where I could be accused of being ageist, but I am a person who goes from coast to coast to coast. I go to schools and school districts all across this country. I speak to anywhere between 50 to 100 to 150,000 teachers, students, administrators from every single place in this country. And I can tell you something with all frank honesty. Young people, Indigenous, Canadian, newcomers, are getting a lot of information they've never gotten before. In many pockets and corners, they're also getting that not just from schools, but also from media, from their parents, from really amazing, important leaders in their communities. Think about this. In Manitoba, 20% is Indigenous. That means 1 of every 5 people. And so that means conversations happen every day. It's right in front of you, the impacts of colonialism. And you can't just simply go, oh, well, Indigenous peoples must choose to sleep outside. That's the most inane, silly thing I've ever heard in my life. Nobody would ever choose to live a life that is in danger, poverty, in diabetes. Like those are just like nobody would choose that life. Everybody would want to live in a safe place with good food, with family around them. Every single person would want to live in a place in which there's joy. That being said, the young people are doing okay. We have much more work to do. We on the University of Manitoba campus have the largest on-campus First Nations Inuit Métis group of students in history. 3,248 or 84, I can't quite remember the exact number, but we are the highest amount in history. That's doctors, lawyers, nurses, teachers. And they are coming up proud. They know their culture, tradition, language. They can learn all of those things more, of course, but they are coming up with a generation of amazing elders, leaders, parents like Eugene. I like to think myself in that. I've raised a young Anishinaabe Cree young woman who is very proud of who she is. And now they're going out, they're becoming they're becoming musicians, they're becoming dentists, they're becoming business owners. And so all of those things are indicative that we have much more work to do, of course, with youth, but we can't just focus on youth, because I'm going to be honest for a minute. And in fact, on reconciliation and truth and reconciliation in particular, the most competent generation are not the ones in charge. They are the ones who are in charge are people who never learned about residential schools, who never learned about the Indian Act, never learned about land theft, never learned about the preponderance of laws that banned Indigenous rights, the massive amount of violence that continue to happen in communities through child welfare, justice, health, all those things that are the barriers ultimately for us to implement the next 43 calls, or from 43 to 94 calls, which are to create things we've never created before. And we have only scratched the surface of a couple of them. And I think that the barrier between ourselves getting to reconciliation once we learn about truth is that older people have yet to even scratch the surface of truth in many corners of this country. And too many people are still debating the why, and it is the youth that are leading the conversation on the how. But they're not the ones in charge. They're the ones usually entry level. They're not the CEOs. They're not the prime ministers or premiers. They're not the people who are professors and doctors and lawyers yet. They're coming. But right now, unfortunately, in those power positions that I just listed off, could be some of the most incapable people or uneducated people, and not bad people, because I don't think there's any bad people, but I think people have learned bad things. People who have learned bad things, who are in powerful positions, who are holding up reconciliation, because the youth are hearing more truth than ever. Many Canadians of my age and above are hearing that truth, but there are many of us, particularly also in that age category, who learned some really, really terrible things growing up, or maybe learned half things or ignorant things, and it made a sense of incompetency when it comes to dealing with truth and reconciliation in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the hopeful part, is that a lot of this behavior is learned, but it can also be unlearned, and people can find ways to contribute to that. You had said, Eugene, that reconciliation is a buzzword, but the TRC was very clear that reconciliation needed to be a relationship, one that was built, over time through conscious action. And I wonder, given our time, if I could ask one of the questions that was asked, and get your thoughts on things, which was, how. Sorry, Eugene.
I got you, Sean. I got you. But as much as I admire the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all of the team, there are just some things that we have to agree to disagree on. And in my case, reconciliation is one of them, as a standalone word. Okay. I talk with fellow survivors all the time. I want to give you a real life case study. Okay. We've all heard of these experiments across the land on us. Well, I heard them the same as you did. But I was also, every time these experiments are revealed, I kind of like say, well, it happened over here, it happened over there. Well, last week I'm in a meeting with fellow survivors from across the land at the National Center, and we're getting a presentation by a researcher out of Guelph. And the document she reveals is this document. And what this document says, that in 1961 and 1962, at St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, experiments were conducted on us. I had no idea. When I say that this constantly, continuously haunts me, how would you feel if you were me? 72 years old and somebody makes a presentation on an experiment that was done on you when you were 9 and 10 years old. I remember this being done. They used food, they put baskets of apples and said, line up, come and get this needle, come and get this shot. I recall that. I was so traumatized last week. I'm actually traumatized right now because I'm scared to show it to my schoolmates and my classmates and my own family, one of whom is a registered nurse who can interpret these crazy words that are on here for me, because I don't understand what they are. But I recall the fallout of those experiments, and they said nothing happened. Well, from my side, and what I see with fellow students all scabbed up and sorted up, not coming home, not coming back to residential school after they went home for Christmas, and they're wondering why did these kids not return? Well, how would you feel? And your 9-year-old kid and your 10-year-old kid comes back from residential school, all scabbed up and sorted up, and told, oh, they're going to be okay. That's not okay. It's not okay. It was not okay during the Holocaust, and it's not okay today, because we're still experiencing the fallout of Indian residential schools. And the Jewish people have supported us in saying the difference between the Holocaust and what's going on now is the residential school era, and the fallout of the residential school era is still prevalent in society today. So we're going to be running out of time. I want to applaud you, Sean, of course, Niigaan, but I want to applaud all those young people that are out there listening for having the courage to come and step up and listen to this. I know some of you were looking for a level of sensationalism, and I hope you got your wish. But today, my bottom line on the wish is we're not going to be here for very long as residential school survivors. We hold nothing against you. We want to share our lived experience and our experiences with you, not to cry on your shoulder, but to make sure that this next generation doesn't experience to the level that we are right now, being an industry in our own country, especially Western Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. You answered the question I was going to ask, which is, why is it so important to center the truth in this, and how can people have the courage to learn that truth and put that truth to action? And perhaps, given our time, I could ask Niigaan to quickly respond to that as a way of sort of wrapping up our lunch and learn opportunities for this weekend as we get set for Orange Shirt Day next week.
Well, I mean, remember that this is a tough time for everyone, and it's a tough time particularly for those of us who are intergenerational survivors. Some of us are still only hearing the stories for the very first time. I was at a gathering, as I mentioned yesterday, in a small school, and one of the grandsons, there was a survivor speaking at the microphone and told a very difficult story to the audience, and the grandson turned to me and said, I've never heard that story before. And we're still hearing those stories because in many ways, survivors want to, they're our grandparents. They want to take care of us and support us. And so we are still learning about our own experiences in relation with the schools. At the same time, Canadians are also learning for the very first time about their relationships with the schools and how, as Eugene pointed out, people profited off the schools. Canadians benefited tremendously from the removal of children and communities off lands, and the atrophy that it created in community by removing children, all the different division that it sowed. And Canada has built an entire economy now off of the trauma and legacies from the schools themselves, and the jail system, and the justice system, the healthcare system, the education system, and continues to profit. I agree very much with Eugene that if you remove Indigenous peoples from the equation in virtually every corner of the country, there would be a lot of systems that would just by being financially inoperable. That being said, I just want to address one question that is keeps coming up in the chat, keep coming up in the Q&A, and I think we should address it. I think we should address it very quickly. We don't have a lot of time. Is the idea of criminalizing denialism, and the idea of course, my good friend and colleague and from Winnipeg Center, Leah Gazan, who suggested that we should criminalize certain forms of speech when it comes to denialism. It's a slippery slope when we come to criminalizing speech, but I always do believe that when you spread misinformation, you should not be allowed to do that without any consequence. When you simply ignore vetted research, things that have been proven time and time again, it can do real life harm to people. As I mentioned before, if a gravity denier should never fly a plane, a residential school denier should never talk about Indigenous peoples' culture, history, and the relationships that we share in Canada, because frankly, they are incompetent to do so. They are spreading misinformation, and they are choosing to not become competent through engaging, adequate, credentialed, well-researched information that is followed by and created by people who actually work in this issue, not just cherry pick a bunch of stuff and meet somebody on a Thursday and then write a book about it. That's the problem. And so there should be a consequence. And I think if you look at it in many corners, there have been consequences. Universities have to step up, but I also know that universities have also been sued when they try to hold people to account. And so I think that's the buffer. That's the kind of gap between we might want to look at not so much at times criminalizing speech, because I think that's a slippery slope, can be very complicated, although if it does create harm, we do have hate speech laws in this country. But we should support institutions that are engaging the issue of hate speech, denialism, denying basic facts, and then trying to purport and pass that on as legitimate information when it simply is not. And so we should be supporting those institutions and individuals when they engage and they encounter that information that just simply it does harm people. So that being said, I say miigwech and thank you. I'll hand it back to Sean, and I think we're a very short amount of time left.
Yeah, thanks Niigaan and Eugene, and I'll hand things over to Sandra because I think we're wrapping up. Thanks to everyone for being here.
I can only echo that. I cannot think of three better speakers to address this. Eugene, there have been so many expressions of gratitude in the Q&A for the sharing of the painful, inexcusable things that you've lived. So please know there is so much out there. If I have a chance, I'm going to send you all of that. Niigaan, Sean, thank you. Thanks to all three of you, to our colleagues with Shapeshifter, to the interpreters, and to everyone who has taken a moment out of their days in preparation for Orange Shirt Day on Tuesday, what is time, to come and learn with open minds and hearts to hear the truth. Thank you to everyone today. Have a good Orange Shirt Day.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Niigaan.
Miigwech, Eugene, Sean, and Sandra, and everybody at the NCTR. Miigwech, everybody, and miigwech to our sign language interpreter as well. So,
yes, thank you. You guys are awesome as usual. Niigaan, how come you're not wearing orange?
I'm right here. But
this is supposed to be orange. It looks brown, but it's actually orange.
All right.
Everybody. Bye.